Hello, I am Nicole Glenn, the co host of the LLC podcast. And it's an honor to introduce listeners to inspiring women who are making a real difference in logistics and supply chain. With the LLC podcast, you'll hear inspirational stories, both personal and professional challenges our guests overcame, how their backgrounds helped shape who they are today, and how they empower others, giving back to their communities and often the world. So today we are coming together with a very special guest on our panel. So we have Ellen Voie. Ellen, thank you for joining some of the ladies of LLC. We're very excited to have you with us today.
Well, I'm so excited to be here. I just love what you're doing. And I think that, by us sharing any insight and knowledge that we have, it only makes supply chain a better place.
I agree. I totally agree. We were talking before we hit the record button, like the whole concept of this show is to really get people to understand the different things that they could do to step over some of the hurdles and obstacles that really all of us and our guests that come on have seen. So today we're going to really be diving into the concept of obstacles. But first of all, we always love to give a market date when we're all together on what we're seeing happening from our viewpoints and our space. Because as you know, every single person that we have as a panelist or co-panelist here is going to be with the transportation emphasis. So we love to give some supply chain insight on what we're seeing from our little segments of the world. So Kristy, I'm going to throw it over to you as the intermodal queen, right? What you're seeing in your world right now. What's going on?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually just got back from Dallas yesterday. Was at the BNSF Logistics forum that they hold every year and give updates about what's going on, what they're doing. And, definitely some interesting stuff that's going on in the space because not only BNSF, but the UP, they're actually putting some stuff in place on the West Coast to make it easier if we have another issue like the pandemic and all this freight was to come in, being able to put those containers on trains and bring them inland and do the transloading so they're not all stuck at the piers. So I thought that was interesting, but it's a project that's going to take a couple years kind of to get off its feet. But it'll be interesting to see if customers are going to really go back to bringing so much freight to the West Coast because we've seen them make shifts to the other coast and down in Texas and some other areas. I was actually interviewing the transportation director of GE a couple months ago, and they talked about changing their strategy and kind of diversifying where they're bringing their freight in so that they don't get stuck in a situation like that. So I thought that was interesting. And obviously they're tackling those challenges to make sure if we see another situation like that, that we're more prepared or they're more prepared for customers when those things happen. We're also still seeing where the rates on the truck side are still very competitive, and it's been a challenge to get some of that business back on the intermodal side. I will say my company in general, though, has been seeing an uptick since the middle of March and bringing in more intermodal volume. And our volume is actually back to the 2019 numbers, which is good to see because we were really capped on our capacity the last couple of years in that space. So I think the interesting part will be when is that floor going to be where the pricing comes up on the truckload side and you can bring more on the rail side. I know there's a lot of talk about sustainability, ESG. So I think rail is a really good option for customers to have in their tool belt, I call it, because I think it's good for them to diversify too. So when things happen on the truck side, they have another option on the intermodal side and vice versa. If you're not doing that, I feel that it puts you in a position when you need it, where you might not be able to get what you need because you didn't have those relationships in place, even if it's a few lanes and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I'm excited about this year. I mean, it's still, I would say flat, so to speak, what they're saying out there. But our company is definitely seeing some transition on that side. A couple of our customers are transitioning some freight, even if the pricing is maybe close. But then there's customers that are saying, hey, right now, putting it on a truck is easier. We don't have to deal with demurrage charges. During the peak, during COVID and whatnot, there was a lot of times customers were stuck paying a lot of charges and they don't want to be in that position again. So if it's easier to put it on a truck, and it's even close or a little bit more competitive, I think that those customers are going to continue to do truck until that continues to rise to a point where it makes sense to put it back on rail. So
I do have one question for you, because we keep hearing, and it's an ever-growing problem of freight fraud, right? So
yes,
theft of cargo is like, it's always been there. So I know that when things start upticking, media has a great way of shining huge lights on things that were already happening. But would that be a selling point for the intermodal side? Like, there's so much fraud that we're seeing now, double brokering and issues. Is that something that would be beneficial for people to think about to come to the intermodal side?
I would say yes and no, only because the intermodal side is also seeing a lot of issues with theft on the trains while they're moving. And some of it obviously are in some key areas. And the BNSF actually talked quite a bit about, what they're doing in LA in particular, where they have these big walls up and they have barbed wire. They're like, it looks like a jail facility, to be quite honest, to keep people out of the ramp, I guess, people going in the ramp. But the other part is when trains, are longer, which they've been, and in cases coming into some ramps and then slowing down to come into a ramp or an interchange point, slow enough where people can get on the train and then start opening containers to just see what's in the back. So we actually had a customer about 2 months ago that had 6 containers broken into on the trains, CSX in particular, outside of or around Atlanta area. And they were seeing a lot of that there. And then also in Memphis. Memphis was a really big spot. So the railroads have their own police, but they're not like outside all these tracks all the time. Some of our customers are putting tracking in the containers when the doors open. The rails say they have this in some of the containers as well. So they're getting like the areas of where it's actually happening so they can actually go to those areas. But typically you're still bringing the train into the ramp. Then you're, evaluating what containers, how much loss. I would say this year and last year was probably the most I've ever seen in my whole career, even on the rail. It wasn't a ton, but it was enough, not just with us, but with the community at large, that it's a huge, huge issue, because that customer in particular I was just talking about was talking about taking it off the rail and putting it on truck, but they were also seeing it on the truck side too. So I think the biggest thing around that is educating customers on what they can do to try to make it more secure, putting different seals that are harder to get into. If it's just a seal you can break right off, that's going to be easy to get into. Let's put bolt seals. Let's try to do other things. I know some things too was even taking containers out of ramps where we had to put them in secure yards and back them up against a wall so you can't even open the doors. Right. That type of thing. So now they're even saying too that it's more like organized crime. That's, before it was maybe just a typical person just trying to do something bad and seeing if they could get something. But to be honest, like now they feel it's really like an organized crime ring that's doing this. So there's a lot of talk about that right now with the railroads. And I can tell you they're spending a ton of money and focus on that.
I'm sure. And it sounds to me like there's a really big opportunity for someone who wants to really focus on different locking mechanisms inside of trailers these days. Cost effective though, right? Because there's so much cost with running a truck, but something that will make things way more secure for people to not have this issue of, dealing with just a tiny little piece of plastic and maybe a little padlock.
Right. And the interesting part is some customers aren't willing to even pay that extra cost. I almost feel like maybe they feel that all of that should be on the railroad protecting it, but there's only so much you can do, or even with a trucker, if they're at a truck stop overnight and things like that. So I just feel it's also the responsibility of the shippers, BCOs, to make decisions that they can to better keep their freight safe, because I don't think it's ever going to go away. It might get better, obviously, but we all have to do this together as a team. So
I agree with that. Well, thank you for that update, Kristy. That's interesting stuff to hear. And I'm glad to see that you guys are even upticking. it's great. I get this mix of people, some who are still kind of in the same spot that I'm talking to, others that are down. So uptick, I'll give you a thumbs up.
Yeah. And I will also say too, real quick, like obviously I think some of the longer haul stuff in general is where we're seeing that too, where it makes sense. But yeah, I'm happy to take it. Keep it coming.
Yeah, right. So I'm going to jump to Ellen too, because Ellen, you bring a totally different perspective, right, from what we normally talk about in regard to the transportation side. You have a significant importance because you're looking at how people are entering into the space, how people are staying into the space, the safety of the space for people. So I'd love to hear, like, what do you see happening from your perspective and your lens right now in the transportation segment?
Well, first of all, I just came back from Australia, and I will tell you, and I've spoken all over the world in different countries, we're all feeling the same pressures. And those pressures are an uncertain economy, interest rates, for us, a political situation, potential wars, canal stoppages, things like that. But also gender, the supply chain has always been traditionally very male populated. And so we all see a need to bring more women into the industry. And whether you're looking at that need as just filling seats, which I think is wrong, which some people do, they're like, oh, wow, women make up 50% of the population, but only, 6% of our driving fleet or whatever. But the reason we should look at more gender diversity is what women bring to the table. And when I say that, I mean, let's talk about whether you're a driver or CEO, you're more risk averse. We make decisions differently. Men will look at the options and then narrow them and then make a quick decision, where women will expand the options and say, did I miss anything? And explore all the opportunities and then make a decision. And it may be the same decision that a man might make, but we come at it in a different way. So if your organization values quick decision making and hierarchical environment, that needs to change to make women more accepted in the industry. And so from the driving perspective, who wouldn't want a more risk-averse driver in the cab of a truck, 80,000 pounds behind them, somebody who is less susceptible to road rage and, less susceptible to taking those risks and doing something like speeding and things like that. So the gender diversity issue is worldwide. It's not just in the United States. I think that we're doing it best in the United States, and I'd like to give Women in Trucking Association, the credit for bringing awareness to what we can do differently. And just quickly, you mentioned a couple things, but one of the biggest issues we have to deal with is making sure that we have a safe environment for everyone. And when I hear of women being harassed at a truck stop or maybe a mechanic, someone telling, not a good joke or using a pronoun that's, profanity, things like that, we shouldn't have to experience that. We should have a safe workplace. So that's been a passion of mine, is like, what can we do to make this industry safer? And whether that means more lighting at shipping and warehouses or better maintained equipment, or the biggest thing is, what is the environment of the company? Do they tell the driver that they're the captain of their ship? Do they tell them that if you feel uncomfortable in an area of protest or maybe a snowstorm or tornado, that you can stop? So big focus on safety, big focus on more gender diverse workforce. When women hit 50% of all drivers and 50% of dispatchers and safety directors and CEOs especially, this will be a whole different supply chain.
I love what you just said. I'm going to hop in here real quick because I interviewed Ingrid Brown a couple weeks ago, and she did touch on like the fact that there weren't women facilities at truck stops and the safety part of it, right? And that she still doesn't see many women drivers out there. And I did ask her, like, when you go into a truck stop and you see a woman, like, how is that interaction? Are you kind of like, hey, like, it's great to see you? And it was interesting because she mentioned that it was kind of like 50-50. Some women are engaging and some are not as engaging. Not sure why. But she's also leading the force with some things that she's doing out there too, with getting, an app out there as well, or, working with them in regards to finding places for, the women to park, and not just women, like safety in general, like you mentioned, but it was interesting to hear from a woman truck driver some of those same things.
So I'm so glad you brought that up, Kristy. And so, Nicole, if you don't mind, I'm going to elaborate on that, because you just said some of them will respond positively and some won't. So after doing research, have you heard of the queen bee syndrome? The queen bee syndrome is when a woman is in a very male environment and she's the only woman. And so she is the queen bee. And so there's a lot of women in this industry. When I started Women in Trucking, I would talk to women who had been in for 20, 30, 40 years, and they'd go, "You weren't around when I started. Why should I support you?" And I would say to them, "Because we need your insight. We need you to help pull up the next person." And if there's one thing that frustrates me is when women aren't supportive of other women. And there's too much of that out there. But for all of the women who are the queen bees, I would say, please reconsider and please help giving a hand up to the new people in the industry, because they really need you. And us, Nicole, Kristy, we've been in the industry for a number of years. That's what this is about. This is in what, this whole podcast and helping other women and giving them a hand up is so that they don't make the mistakes we made. But they also have someone that maybe a mentor or a sponsor who can support them. So if there's one thing that I wish people would really pay a lot of attention to is, how do we as women support other women?
Ellen, did they say, like, when you've asked that too, that they've had to get tough skin, like the thick skin because of it, and it's made them almost, lose a little bit of empathy?
So when I see newer drivers who will say things like, "Well, we should have vegan options at the truck stop," right? And the women who have been in the industry go, "You're lucky you have a shower," because it used to be a locker room shower. So the women who have been in the industry for years will look at the newer ones and go, "You're a bunch of whiners." And it's not that. It's like, we have to ask, we have to create change. We have to ask for that change. We have to make sure that people are aware of what changes need. And so a quick, we've worked with truck cab designers on truck cab design and ergonomics. And Ingrid Brown is a perfect example. She drives Packard vehicles and she's just 5'2", and she talked about how she couldn't even open the hood until they put hydraulics in. Well, okay, we have hydraulics in to open the hood to do the pre-trip. A lot of women had to sit on pillows or they couldn't reach the pedals. The showers, I used to go with my former husband, and when you went into a shower, it was like the locker rooms in high school. So if you wanted to take a shower, you had to make sure that all the men were kicked out and somebody stood at the door, not let them in. And don't even let me get started on uniforms and gloves and things that were all designed for men before we started pointing out, look, we need more women in this industry, and you need to help us make this industry more gender neutral. And I'm going to close with the fact that we're not trying to make trucks or truck stops for women. We're trying to make them for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as far as women, I've been in the industry since the 80s, and I've had women drivers in the past, and they were wonderful. And yes, they had a hard life, and we would try to do our best to make it easier for them, but they would stand up and speak for themselves, and we encourage that. And now there's so many more, but it's the women that started driving early on that have actually made it where these other women can come on, and it's not perfect yet, and I don't know if it ever will be, but it's so much better than it used to be. And I see why these women are saying, well, I didn't have this and I didn't have that. But most of them that I know will do whatever they can to help. And because they've struggled, they know what it's like, and they want it better for the next generation.
Yeah, I can see that too. I'm sure it's a mix. I mean, this world is a melting pot. I mean, you can't just classify something by women or men or this or that. It's young or old or middle. I mean, you can keep going on some of the stereotypes that happen, right, in any industry. But what we're seeing and what I see too is that if we just start talking about it and we just start lending a hand out there and start being more open to the dialogue. And sometimes, like, you want vegan food, you have to ask outrageously. Like, we have to start planting the seeds on what we can do for people in general to be happy in what they're doing, you know? And I encourage so many women to hop behind this wheel. It's such a great spot for them if we do support them. They can be great breadwinners for their family. They can make great money. You know, they can do all the things. And I feel like the industry is trying to accommodate a little bit more, and we're really doing things differently. Even, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Ellen, with the ability for people to do more local regional work with how the way that the world is changing with distribution. I mean, it's a great spot for people. You can get home same day. Not everything is what it was before, where you're gone for necessarily 6 weeks at a time. I know Ingrid is. I watch her.
Yeah, just gonna say that's what she said. She goes out to California and back, and I was like, that is really cool that you do that, because most people don't want to do that, but she's all about it, and she's got kids and a husband, and so it was great to hear.
Yeah, I mean, women struggle with that role. That is not just a for everybody to do. Right. Get hop in a truck and to go around the country. You know, that's a lot. That's a tolling, taxing job too.
You know, it depends on where you are in life, you know. So like if your kids are grown, you know, then you can travel and see them, you know, on occasion. But if you still have little children at home, you need a job that you're home a lot more. And so I always tell them, go haul trash, you know, go do haul trash or make local deliveries.
Well, now that's even changed. Like, the trash comes and it's a big claw that comes and grabs stuff. It's like anyone can really do that job. You know, you don't have to be able to lift a 200-pound piece to throw it in the back anymore. Yeah. It is becoming more feasible safely for women to do some of these roles too. It's just also encouraging them and making them realize that they would be supported. And I think that's where we all need to keep spreading the word and also supporting it. So we could talk about this forever. I do want to slide over to Sharon though, because she is living in the truckload world, doing some things right now. So I know everyone's eager to hear what your viewpoint is on what you're seeing in the truckload space today.
So right now, you know, we're struggling. I think a lot of our struggles are because it's an election year. People change during an election year. I don't know why. I've been seeing it for 40 years, and it's always bad. I've never understood why people quit buying product and quit shipping product, because you still have to keep operating, but they do. And so we're seeing a lot of that. Of course, produce season is starting. We're seeing an uptick in price from the carriers, just so you know, Kristy. They're wanting more money. They don't want to go as far. The service has kind of diminished a little bit with the carriers that we're finding calling in. And then the fraud is a huge, huge problem. We do a lot of building supplies. So we do a lot of flatbeds, we do vans, but like right now with the weather and all the storms, we've got issues with roofing. And so we're shipping a lot of shingles. And so we just had a whole shipment of shingles stolen. And the insurance companies a lot of times won't pay those claims, because if they can figure out that if it was an inside job with the driver, they won't pay the claim. And then we're on the hook for it. And so we're very careful about how we haul shingles. We don't do any shingles over the weekend, because we don't want them parked anywhere, because you're at risk of them getting stolen. I advise people not to just hire people off the street to put shingles on their roofs, because they're usually gypsies and it's probably stolen shingles that they're using. So we're seeing that. And then with produce moving, the pricing is going up. It's harder to find trucks. We're moving. We don't move produce, but a lot of people do. They have to. So there's produce moving out of the valley in Texas and of course California, and this is going to be an issue throughout the summer. But prices are going up, and it's a big shock for our customers. They always have this big shock about, why is this so much? It was this much 2 weeks ago. But it's just, you have to sell it and you have to explain it to them. So it's important that everybody understands what the market is doing, so you can share that with your customers. And I've learned something this week that I had never heard of before. We also ship like copper wire, and they have slowed down their shipping. And they told us that it's because of the sanctuary cities that they're not being able to sell it as much and ship it, because the sanctuary cities aren't buying right now. So that has slowed their business down. I've never heard that before. So I'm going to have to dig into this and find out a little more about that. So it's, like you said, there's always an issue and you learn something new every day, and you don't know what's going to cause it. But one of the things we're trying to do as far as the fraud, we're trying to educate our customers to please check who the driver is when they pull up, to make sure that the carrier we're sending in is the carrier that's on the door of their truck. And if it's not, don't load them, call us, because they have to have the name of the company that we're doing business with on their truck. We'll send them away. We hear all the time, well, we're leased on to so-and-so. Now, if you're leased on with so-and-so, you still have to wear, have to have the decals that who you're hauling for. So you just have to be careful, educate your customers, and hopefully we can get through this somehow. But what we are learning is a lot of these, like you said, Kristy, organized crime, a lot of Armenians from overseas are doing this. They're not even here in the United States. So you have factoring companies that are involved in it, as well as the carriers and the shippers.
Well, I was going to say too, with you bringing that up, like, it's great that you're educating the customer, because at the end of the day, it's a team effort, and they have to be more aware as well, because there's only so much we can do on our end, and there's tools and all that kind of stuff out there to really help. And we did invest in a tool called Highway, and we haven't had an issue since, but you have to set certain rules and stuff, and just be more careful what type of carriers you are bringing on. But I think it's great you are talking to customers about it.
Yeah, I do want to chime in too on that, Sharon, because we do some truckload at Candor. And so with that, we've been talking to some of our clients, because we have seen an uptick too on some of the carrier rates. And so we've approached it as, hey, this is where we're at. We're open. That's the whole reason why I named this company Candor, right? Is to tell people where we're at. And then we give them the ability to shop to make sure that our rate is in line, even though it is changing. And they have come back and said, yeah, your rate is in line from what we're seeing out there. So then again, that relationship piece with your customers, I think that's so important. I know we get into these spots where you hear shipper of choice when things are tight and capacity is tight, and it does this pendulum sway. But the whole thing is having a relationship with your customer, talking to them, being real, shooting them straight. And when you have those types of relationships, you tend to get, more response than just, oh, your rate's now $150 higher, get out of here. It's that relationship piece that really matters. And I think what we do. So I can hop in and give a mini, because I don't want to talk too long. I want to talk about obstacles, but for the people who are interested on the expedited side, I'm sorry, it's literally been tough. So what we've been seeing too is that even the amount of requests and quotes that have been coming on the expedited side have been soft and light. There's so much truck capacity, there's intermodal capacity. So we are the first legs to get kicked out from that table when things go to the shipper's favor, right? Or I shouldn't say that, to the economy's issues. So no one wants to spend the money on the expedite. They also have that capability that sometimes I've seen truckload pricing cheaper than a straight truck. That has happened to us as of late. So we have to then educate our straight truck carriers, like, hey, this is really where the market sits. We can now have team service for, the same price sometimes, if not less than a straight truck. So that has been an interesting factor for us. Now, thankfully, my business has diversified. So we're, stepping into the domestic air freight sector and doing a lot of multimodal moves. So we call more of that white glove across the country expedited LTL, a line haul scenario with first and final mile services. So that has been the good side of us. And we have seen a significant uptick on that. But as a $20 million company, I can't tell you exactly what everything is happening in the industry. I just know that what it takes is the consistency, hard work, and the grind. So our numbers itself have been up, even with what I'm telling you, it being soft, because again, that team, that tenacity, and that grind right now is the most important part for when things get tight for companies asking for those opportunities. So I'm always chirping at my team to ask outrageously and go, can I have it? Can I have it? Can you give it to me? Can I do this? And sometimes it works. So if anyone else has questions after listening to this on what you're wanting to pick our brains on, please, don't hesitate to reach out to Kristy, myself, Ellen, Sharon as well on these different segments. And, we can always talk to you guys on the sidelines on what you're seeing and hopefully give you some guidance on maybe better best practices or different things that can help you. So now I want to jump into what we talked about. We have been talking about this forever since the pandemic. I have known Kristy and Sharon and kind of you, Ellen, too. Like all of you guys came from that networking time on, when we were all kind of on lockdown and we were trying to get out there and see what was going on without actually getting out there. So I know for me during that time, that was not the first obstacle that I've had as an entrepreneur, and definitely not as a person working in the transportation space. But recently it's made me realize, man, we just keep getting one thing after the other, right? Of change that's either happening internally in companies or the industry or the economy. And it actually started to comfort me to know, like, hey, this is what it is. Like, that's what we have to do consistently, is just learn how to calmly handle our obstacles. So I want to ask you ladies, and I'm going to just throw this out here as a general question, and whoever wants to kind of jump in, I would love to hear your feedback. But from being in this space for so long, what have you learned about obstacles and how you treat them? And I should say one more thing. How does that help our younger generation of people that are stepping into these roles and positions and things in their lives at this point in time?
I'll start. I'll say what I've learned is, obviously this is my 26th year, believe it or not. And I felt like it was a lot easier, obviously early on. And I guess in a different context, we weren't shipping a whole lot of freight, right? So there wasn't a ton of challenges, I would say, maybe at that time. But growing a company and even the last couple years in particular, with COVID and bringing just challenges with, the hybrid work environment and all these different things that we're talking about, fraud and, and I feel like just things are getting, I don't want to say worse. It's just you fix something and then something else comes up. And I think, what I've learned is that's what we're like in the business for. It's a challenge, right? If it was easy, everyone would do it. And I think it's taught you how to really find different ways, reach out to other people, really collaborate more with your teams, which maybe there wasn't a whole lot of that in the past. It was really like, for me, it was like my dad really making decisions himself, and maybe me and John that runs my company, like us talking now, like we're really inviting everyone else to the conversation and getting different feedback. Because I think even with the other generations coming up, they might have a different perspective on what they're seeing and how we could solve things and look at it differently. So I think there's just so much more reaching out, networking, talking about this with other people, because sometimes we feel like we're the only ones dealing with these issues. And then you find that everyone is dealing with these issues. So I think that that's something that's important to do, but it's always something that's consistently going, and it's really digging deep and really just really getting into it and saying, like, I think me and you talked about this the other day. It's like, it just keeps coming at you and it's not going to stop. You might get a little bit of this like break time, so to speak, where, things are going okay. And, and whatnot. But then next thing you know, the next big issue comes up. And honestly, my company, the last, I would say, year and a half in particular, put COVID aside, like just growing the company, investing in technology, and at the size we're at, I feel like we had the perfect storm of issues. We had so many different things going on that some people look at me and they're like, how did you even make it through? And I'm just like, you just have to keep going. Like, you can't just stop and cry. And not saying you don't have those private moments at home that's like, you know, where you break down at times, but at the end of the day, you just keep going. And that's my mentality.
I'd like to jump in from women are more collaborative typically and team oriented. And so running a nonprofit association like Women in Trucking means listening to our members, which means what are their pain points? Because none of us know what the people around us are feeling. So it's really like, what obstacles are you addressing? And maybe I have the authority to fix it, or maybe I don't, but maybe someone else does, or maybe as a team we can work on it or whatever. But it's really all about listening and learning and figuring out sometimes you might be really surprised that somebody is dealing with an issue that you could have solved easily, but they didn't come to you. So it's really about being open. And like you said, Nicole, being transparent and letting people know that, you know, you're ready to listen and ready to help solve problems, because it takes a village, right?
Sure. So like Ellen, going back in time, even pre-pandemic, and you started an association, I'm sure that you consistently walked into issues with that. So your biggest takeaway as someone who's developed a career, right, around building this association, how did you navigate all of those things? I know you're saying being transparent and different things, but I'm sure you've had some tough days, kind of like what Kristy was just alluding to, on constant changes. And I mean, you even had to deal with regulation. You're trying to help people with regulation, right? So,
right.
Yeah,
so it's all about resiliency. It's pivoting. So I always tell people, don't start a nonprofit in the middle of a recession, because I started Women in Trucking in 2007. And what is the one thing that people can set aside? It's dues to an association. It's just not a top priority, right? So the first couple of years when people would say, boy, I really like what you're doing, but I just don't have the money to renew, we gave them an extension. And we made the decision, we'll give you a 3-month extension, and maybe that'll help you, keep, it didn't cost us anything to give them a 3-month extension, but it made them feel valued, that we cared enough about them to extend their membership. So, coming up with ideas that accommodate the members, while, again, lifting up, what is it? A rising tide lifts all boats. And I really believe that. I really think that we all have an obligation to help each other and lift each other up and make the supply chain environment a better place.
Yeah, I preach all the time. You have to have a tribe of women that you can go to. And if nothing else, just let them hear you vent, because you need that outlet. And women just, you can't really go to men because they don't understand what you're going through and they want to fix it, and you don't want them to fix it. You just need some advice, maybe some ideas. I know I wouldn't make it without Kristy and Nicole. I mean, they're like my rocks. And so I think everyone needs that. And then like this program, if we can talk about these things, it helps other women. And the more we do that, the more we grow our audience and other women who need help. They learn that it's not just them. I know for a long time, when there were no other women in this industry, I was all alone and I didn't know what to do. I mean, I lost a business once and I didn't have any help. And so now I wish I had known then what I know now, but I mean, I didn't have anybody to go to. I mean, there just weren't any. And so I think we're at a better place, and we just have to sometimes, this is what I have to do sometimes, just take a deep breath, close the computer, and just rest. And then come back with a clearer mind and go, okay, how can I fix this? What am I going to do? I'm not going to fail. I'm going to get through this, but also know that there are people out there that have your back.
Absolutely. I know I've done that too, Sharon, because I want to make sure that I'm responding in a logical way instead of an emotional way. I don't think that has anything to do with my gender. I think it's just something that, as humans, when something hits you as a challenge or an obstacle, you first of all, you take it personal, right? Everything we take personal, like, wow, why did that happen to me? Holy cow, So I try to make sure that I pause, like you say, and go, let me let that soak in, and I just give me a few minutes, and I'm going to get back to you, or even to myself sometimes, like, like close that and just think about that and start again tomorrow, because if I react, sometimes I do make quick decisions. So I have to make sure that when I hit one of those obstacles, I like kind of read through it and then take more of the logical approach.
Yeah, well, I read a book one time. It's called "If It's Not Broke, Break It," and because sometimes we do things a certain way so long that we think that's the only way to do it, and sometimes you got to look at it and go, "How can I do this differently?" Just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that's the way to do it. And sometimes it improves your business, it improves your personal life. It's just change it up a little bit, and it just makes it more enjoyable, because sometimes, like we talked about yesterday, I just don't even want to go to work. You're just so tired, and you just don't think you can do this another day. And so, but when you think about it and go, okay, we can do this, let's get a little creative with it, and then figure it out, and then it gets better.
Yeah. Would any of you be willing, like Ellen, do you have any stories that you can share, like of an obstacle that at the time it like just stopped you in your tracks, and then now you look back at it, obviously that was probably a learning lesson that you needed to have, right? But where you look back at it and you go, holy cow, that really was not a big deal.
There was a point where I had a board chair who was came from a financial background, and all she ever focused on was money. And I'm very mission driven. A nonprofit should run by its mission, and she and I butted heads all the time. And we were having some financial difficulties at Women in Trucking, and I think it was because my heart and soul wasn't in it. And so I went through this. It's called Halftime. So I went through this journey to determine where is the right place for me, and what do I want to do in this second, part of my career. And what I learned was, because I kept saying, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to empower women. I want to lift up women. They go, look at the audience you have. Why would you want to leave? And so I had to buckle down and really come to terms with the fact that she really focused on money and I didn't. And so I waited her out.
That had to be hard, right? Dealing with it and hanging on to that. But now we're about it now, right?
When you work for a nonprofit, you have a board of directors, and you don't really feel like they understand you. It's a very lonely position because your board doesn't really understand what you're doing. Your members don't really understand what you're doing. Your staff doesn't really understand your role. So it's a very lonely position. But I had to decide that I was going to stay. Because I was on the pivot, ready to walk away and go find a better paying job in the for-profit world, and so where I could make a difference. But after going through this whole process, I learned that no, if I want to empower women, I needed to stay with Women in Trucking and continue to do that. And ironically, we suddenly doubled our profits. I mean, suddenly the money started flowing in and things started, and I really think it was my mindset. I really think that by saying, nope, I'm staying here and I'm going to make this the best organization ever. And it was quite a few years ago. It was over 10 years ago, but it really did change things. And the organization kept growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. So I felt like I was in the right position, and that was where I needed to be.
That's awesome. Yeah. Sharon, what do you have? I'm sure, I mean, you've been in this industry forever, so I'm sure there's quite a few where you are put beside yourself, right?
Yeah, so years ago, this is probably one of my biggest, and I've never forgotten it. During the fourth quarter, I always moved Christmas trees because it just helped me make money for the first quarter, because first quarter was slow. So I made Christmas trees for years. And one year, one of the buyers or sellers that I had always done business with moved to another company. And because I knew him, I didn't check out their credit. I didn't check out anything. I just started moving trees for him. Well, they never paid me anything. And it was like $100,000 worth of movements. And I fought, and I thought, and I was by myself. I mean, I was just working as an agent, basically. And I couldn't pay my trucks because they weren't paying me for the Christmas trees. I had to go to Seattle for a court, to take them to court, and I had to pay all of that. I ended up getting $9,000 out of the whole thing. But I sat down with all of my carriers because I knew me. And I said, this is what happened. And I promise you, I will pay you every dime back, but you got to work with me. And so I closed my company and I went to work for another company as a commission sales rep. So I could make as much money as I could, more than a salary back then. And every dime I made, I went to pay off trucks. And it took me 3 years, but they all worked with me because, in this industry, it's a big industry, but it's a small world. And so I knew if my reputation ever went bad, I'd never be able to work again. And I did. So I paid off every dime, but it was the hardest time of my career. But I'm proud that I was able to do it, because some people would have just quit and said, I'm not going to do this anymore.
I was going to say, it's beyond just your reputation. That's just your integrity.
Yeah. So, but that was probably the hardest thing I ever had to go through in my career.
Yeah. That sounds terrible. Kristy, I'm sure you have something too.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot, but I would probably say my biggest obstacle was my father. I mean, I worked with him a long time, appreciated everything that he had done for me, but it was challenging to work with him, and he pushed me to the limits in so many different ways. At one point I did put my resignation in, and then I realized, like, I need to figure this out. I can do this. This is going to be bigger than I can imagine at some point. Never thought we'd be where we are today. But, that was one of them. And I think some of the biggest ones were him, like, putting me in the position of president of the company, but yet I still couldn't make the decisions. It still had to kind of go through him. I still had to, I guess the obstacle or getting past it was like going through other men in the organization to get things done through him, because it was like, if they were in the industry longer than me and they had an education, then he trusted them over me, even though you put me in the president position. So sometimes, I had to take things into my own hands eventually, when I did get the 51%. And that's when, I had like a mission to get that for a reason. He wasn't keeping money in the company, and we had to fire the old COO, and ultimately I had to just go in and do it without him. Of course, he was upset with me about it, but I was like, we're not going to have a business if this decision isn't made. And so there was just so many along the way. And I sit there and look back thinking, how did I have the strength to get through that? Because it was tough. And I do talk about, I love my dad dearly. He's no longer with us, but I like talking about it because so many people do go through this too. And it got to a point too, eventually, where my dad, because he wanted things, whether it was, more money or certain things done, if I didn't do it his way, like he even threatened to sue me at one point. So it was a very challenging thing to get through, but I just kept pushing through and doing what was right for the company, because at the end of the day, I knew that all the people that worked for me, if we didn't do the right thing, they're not going to continue to work for me. Like, what's the point? So yeah, I could share a million different things, but I'll just say that kind of sums it up in a few different ways.
For sure. Well, I told you guys it would go really fast. Like, it's over, our show. We have run out of time. But I do want to thank you, Ellen, for joining us today. I had you on for a interview series before, and I'm going to share that link because I do want people to hear that whole story that you and I had, the one-on-one. But I would love to have you back on here. You're great to have on here and give that perspective. And, we're all in that era of like coming together and really trying to build the tribe to help lift the other women in this space. So I have mad respect for you and the other two that are here too. So thank you guys for joining us today. And like I said, if you have any questions or comments about industry, come back to us and we would love to keep talking about it. So enjoy. Hopefully this is a continuation of a great quarter for everyone in our space. Take care, everybody.
Bye.